welcome back to PA Truck Up. I'm your host Manny, and today we have Mike and Meg Stone. How are we?
Good.
Thank you for asking us.
No, it's all good. The thing that the running joke on the podcast is that we've obviously spoke before the podcast, so I know yous are okay, but I like to ask it just in case. So for anyone that's obviously not heard of yous, which is be very rare, but if you give us a little background on who you are and how you got into strength and conditioning.
Well, actually, I threw, as most people in Scotland would probably know, my background was in track and field. And I competed in a couple of Commonwealth Games and a couple of Olympic Games. And to do that, I had moved to the US, to the University of Arizona, and through there right up until 1984. And then I was really trying to make my mark as a track and field coach. I wanted to become a head coach in track and field. And then the head football coach approached me and asked me if I would be interested in doing the strength and conditioning program for football. And then the AD said, well, it would be all of the sports at the University of Arizona. So from becoming a head track coach, I did a kind of left hand, right hand, whatever you call it, turn, and moved right into another area, strength and conditioning. But I had quite a background in developing a program, how to put a program together with some of the coaches that I had worked with in Great Britain. So it was kind of an easy move into strength and conditioning. And then, of course, a couple of years later, I met my husband, who was really the leading authority at that point, still is, in strength and conditioning, and just continued on from there. You know, when the coach approached me at Arizona about strength and conditioning, I was reluctant at first because I wanted to be a head track coach. But then he gave me the hook. You'd be the first woman in the country to do it. And I thought, oops, can't turn that down. So I moved into strength and conditioning. So, Mike, I'm over to you. How did you get into strength and conditioning?
Well, my background was in weightlifting. And, way back when I was an undergraduate, I decided I wanted to learn everything I could about it. And so all of my undergraduate, master's degree, PhD were aimed towards, physiology and performance. And after I graduated, first job was at LSU in the States and continued to do research and so on. Continued as a weightlifter for a while. And so, as I moved up in the profession, so to speak, I was able to do some, what I think was really pretty decent research, and I think over time people began to recognize that. And finally, to make a long story short, we ended up here at East Tennessee State University because we could both get a job in the same place, and we've been here for 20 years now. We're still trying to produce research and talk to people and really enjoy strength and conditioning and talking to people about strength and conditioning.
Was something that in recent years get you still fired up with the same passion that when you started strength and conditioning?
I think one of the things recently that's really perked my interest in strength and conditioning is the influx that we've had recently in women coaching strength and conditioning. There's a lot more women involved with strength and conditioning than there was when I first started. I mean, back in 1972 when I started lifting weights, I was a bit of an oddball, and happy to be that. I remember at Dunfermline College of Physical Education, where I became a physical education teacher. I remember talking to a coach about weight training at Meadowbank, the National Sports Centre at that time. And he said, you're bound to have something at Dunfermline College. And I went to the gym and had a look, and there was a plain iron bar with two little weights on the end. And I thought, that's not really good enough for what I'm looking for. So there was nothing at that point. at a physical education college that had anything to do with weightlifting. So I ended up working with the weightlifters at Meadowbank Sports Centre, trying to increase my strength levels and be able to throw far. And again, one of about 2 or 3 women that were in the weight room. So that has really perked my interest recently, about women getting involved in coaching and women being involved in coaching generally. So yeah, that tends to get me a little bit, pique my interest.
Nice.
I guess for me, of course, I'm still interested in sports, and very much so in weightlifting and track and field, obviously, and have coached both of those, and I still jump in there once in a while and do some coaching. I think in terms of sports science, there's still, in terms of training methodology and that sort of thing, there's still a lot to be done, both in terms of does it work and what are the underlying mechanisms that make it work. And so, as I say, I think there's still some major questions that are out there. Interestingly enough, when we met over at the International Congress of Strength Training in Germany, one of the things that several of us old folks talked about, Schmidt-Bleicher, Hakkinen, and so on, is that if it's going to work with elite and advanced athletes, it'll work with lesser athletes or even untrained people. And there's some good reasons for that. And so I think in terms of sports science, which is what I'm interested in, where you actually work with sports, it's sort of a trickle-down effect. What we find with elite or advanced athletes will work with untrained people as well. And those are the kinds of things that still drive me.
Mm-hmm. I revisited the talk you did for the NSCA, I think it was 9 years ago, when you were defining what strength was. And I think that's unfortunately still a thing that needs to be explained today, because we always talk about developing strength, but the qualities of strength aren't being met because athletes are still weak. And I think it's something that's still needing heavily worked on, is that research piece on like what exactly is strength, how do we build it, and then how do we program it for the specific phases of athletes' development.
Still an ongoing topic is exactly, what methodology to use and how do you, as you say, how do you program that? What exercises, what sets and reps, rest periods, the frequency, the density, and so on down the line. And those are the kinds of things that I'm really, really interested in, because strength is really a vehicle, and with it comes all kinds of things. High intensity exercise, endurance, rate of force development. It's key in producing power output, even velocity of movement. People underestimate the value of strength quite often because it's foundational for just about everything you do. I mean, you can't get up and walk to the door without exhibiting some level of strength.
Mm-hmm. Meg, if I can quickly throw it to you, with obviously living with Mike and you knowing what strength has been defined by, how do you then implement that to the coaching that you're doing and the athletes that you're developing?
The first thing I think, it's really interesting you ask that, Manny, because it has gone through my mind recently of how am I going to do that, because I've been talking to some older gentlemen, older like myself, in their 70s, and how do I implement a program for that older population, because these guys are interested in throwing. And they're telling me they're doing things like leg extensions and leg curls and biceps and triceps and, that kind of thing. I said, well, when you throw, you don't do that with your leg. You squat. And squatting to them has got this huge stigma. And trying to convince them that squats are far more specific to what I can't squat, I've got a problem squatting. I said, well, do you ever sit in a chair? Yeah, if you sit in a chair, well, you can squat. And it's getting away, trying to convince them of first of all, the exercises they need to be doing, and then how you would program that in to their overall training program, with combining the technical and tactical aspects of throwing with the program design in the weight room, and how that all gels together. And so I've been thinking quite a bit about that recently, because these older gentlemen that compete in the Masters are interested in that. So yeah, it's a challenge. And the challenge, first of all, in the generation I'm talking about, that older generation, is convincing them of the type of exercises that's going to be useful to them, and then getting them to realise that doing reps of 10 for the rest of their life is good, but it's maybe not optimal for what they're looking for. So, and then getting them to cycle the reps and sets in a fashion that is going to be optimal for what they want to do. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
Yeah, of course it does. Yeah, because it's so I've spoken with Fred and Val Hale. They're both at Notre Dame. They're married, and sometimes they'll actually bring their work home and be like, "Hey, this is the issue that I'm having programming. This is my athlete. This is what their specifics are. This is the context behind them, essentially." And then they'll actually collaborate on the programs and make it more effective for their athletes. So obviously, yous are also married and a couple. So it's finding, like, how does that cross over to your programming and your development when you do have Mike Stone as a husband, that obviously he's done a lot of the research on this and he can now understand a little bit more of what you're saying compared to, say, me. My fiance is an architect. If I come home with a program, she's like, "Oh yeah, that looks good."
Well, actually, Mike and I collaborated completely when I was coaching throwers here. Mike did the strength and conditioning, well, most of the strength and conditioning program on paper, and I would take that and work with that in the practical situation with the athletes that I had. I mean, I would be really stupid if I didn't lean on them, because you've got one of the world's leading authorities on strength and conditioning. Of course I'm going to collaborate with them, and of course I'm going to be able to apply what his knowledge is in the area is and use that because it's of huge value to the athletes I was working with. And we did that when we were back in Scotland too. Mike did a lot of the work in the weight room as far as coaching and putting the program together, and then I would be out in the field doing the technical stuff. Yeah, it's a very, very worthwhile collaboration.
Mm-hmm. With the programming, how have you both found that developed through the years, and what are some things that you're like some trends that you're currently seeing that A, makes the programs better, and B, has a detrimental effect on it more than the benefits?
Lifter and Meg Stone experimented on ourselves, so to speak, early on. But, once you get into the aspect of actually doing research, we were able to, I guess you might say, go through many, many experimental innovations, starting way back in the 70s. When I was at LSU, one of my students there was a guy named Kyle Pierce, who is one of the leading weightlifting coaches in the world now, and travels all over the world for the International Weightlifting Federation, giving talks about training. And we started there really with, I guess you'd call it the early derivations of block periodization. And over the years, we've done study after study after study. Because one reason, study after study, why do you keep doing so many studies? It's only through replication that you ever really know whether something works or not. I mean, you can use all kinds of fancy statistics, but it's only repeating and repeating and repeating that you really know whether it works. And so over the years, we've done that. And basically, we've come to use block periodization and what we believe is the appropriate programming for that. And it works quite well. Where you start running into problems is where people have used something else and they say, oh, well, this is better and so on. Well, maybe.
This is a quick shout out to our main sponsor on this channel, TeamBuildr. TeamBuildr is all-in-one platform that hosts programs, questionnaires, testing, anything that you may need for your athlete's performance, you can host it in TeamBuildr. TeamBuildr also now has 2 different sides, which is OS and Practice. For more information on TeamBuildr, check out the link in the description. And if you use code PACHOCKUP all together, you will get a 30-day free trial. Our next sponsor is Apex Cool Labs. Apex Cool Labs is a pump cooling device that helps you gain further performance by cooling and aids the recovery so you can perform more for longer. To check out what Apex Cool Labs have, there's a link in the description. So we were talking about programming, some of the effective and less effective ways of programming that you've identified throughout the years.
I think working with Meg, I'm quite lucky there because one of the things we've been able to do over the years is take some of the things that we found in research and directly apply them. So you've got, in a sense, okay, it worked in the research project. Now it seems to be working with these athletes as well. And I think that's quite important.
So this is a question that I've always wanted to ask. And again, I've done quite a lot of conferences, either speaking or just attending. And throughout each conference, you always learn that little new trick, that little tool, something different that you've perhaps not experimented with. But then it's up to you to develop that into, okay, now I need to go back to the gym, test it, see if it works. But then does it then transfer to my athletes? Does it not? And how that essentially goes. But this could be like from, say, a month to 2 months of testing. Then I can slowly trickle into my athletes. With obviously, you've just mentioned that as soon as you've finished one, you can pass over to Meg, and Meg then sort of implements in the programming. How have you found that working in terms of, okay, you finished the research, Meg, here you go. This is what I found. This is where I think it could go. Meg, then how does that transfer to your athletes and the people that you're coaching and sort of implementing these research topics and ideas on?
Interesting, Manny, because as you know, in sport, everybody's looking for the magic bullet that's going to give them the edge above somebody else. And really, I think, there's some basic fundamentals that you need to adhere to if you're going to be successful in your weight program, and then taking that weight program and implementing it side by side with what you're doing in your sport, and to make sure that they're integrated. And I think where a lot of people go wrong is the integration of the work they do in the sport with the weight training program. We talk about add-ons. They'll add on a training program rather than integrate a training program. And that's one of the things that really through Mike's research is something that has been brought home to me and to many of the coaches we've worked with, about the idea of integration of what you've learned in your research and how that integrates with the sport. And I know Doc can talk about the changes in the approach to periodisation from a single periodised year, double periodised year, having moved into this idea of accumulation, etc. And Doc can talk far more eloquently about that than I can, because I really implement some of the stuff that he's very familiar with. So yeah, that whole process, that whole change process of looking at your program throughout the year and year by year. I mean, if you talk to some coaches, they'll just implement the same thing year after year after year. Mm-hmm. Well, how do you prepare somebody for an Olympic Games? And what does each focus of every quadrennium of in the year within that quadrennium hold for that athlete? And how do you manipulate these? Those are the things I think that I've learned through working with Doc on the whole process of periodisation. And people tend to throw it out the window and think, well, you know, I've got this new gadget idea. The tested and true formulas on preparing people are really, the fundamentals are there. It's just tweaking those fundamentals and how you work with them. So I think Doc can probably talk more to the programming on that, because, you know, I'm just put your hip here and put your arm there and do this and do that technically, whereas the whole programming idea is really Doc's expertise.
So what you're saying is you're the pretty face behind the programming.
Exactly, thank you.
I mean,
so that's, sorry.
One of the problems, I think, in strength and conditioning now is, to an extent, what you touched on before. Okay, somebody in a clinic somewhere says, yeah, we did this and
It worked.
miracles happen. Well, when you actually begin to test it, you'll find out there's not too many miracles going on. Basically, it requires some good planning ahead. Obviously, there are times where you have to adjust along the way based on your monitoring of the athlete and various things like injury and so on. But nevertheless, planning is an extremely important aspect, and long-term planning for that matter. If you begin to learn how to do that, you'll find the results in the long term are a lot better than the typical, okay, what are we going to do today? I see that a lot in coaching. Well, we did something else yesterday, so let's do something different today. That's not the best approach.
As scary as this is going to sound, I've actually seen some coaches plan session by session, half hour before the session, which then that brings a whole different set of challenges in itself.
Fortunately, I've seen that as well.
Too often. It's interesting,
you know. Back up. Sorry, off you go.
I was just going to say it's interesting because the whole coaching approach concerns me a little bit. I don't think coaches take it seriously enough. I think when a young person comes to you, or a team that you're working with, whichever, when they put their hopes, ambitions, aspirations to be really good in your hands, that's a really very, very big responsibility you have as a coach. Don't think enough people take that seriously enough. And if that young person does want to work with you and puts their wishes in your hands, you then have an obligation to do the best you possibly can for that team or person. And that really disturbs me when people pull out a workout out of their back pocket and say, here we go. You have a duty then to sit down with that person, get to know them, get to know their background, get to know where they want to go. It's interesting because any kid that you ask, what do you want? Do I want to be Olympic champion? Oh, okay, so you got the fire. You got the fire. So how are we going to go about doing that? How are we going to go about preparing this young person? And that takes a lot of background knowledge and a lot of planning, as Doc's saying, a lot of planning. And I think coaches need to take that seriously, very seriously, more than they do.
Manny, I think one thing that happens often, coaches, maybe particularly strength coaches, go to a meeting and they hear, okay, here's something that is going to revolutionize the world. And we did it for 10 weeks with these untrained people. And so, okay, everybody comes back, we're going to do that now. Well, that's how you get in trouble. First of all, it was probably with untrained people. Even if it was with trained people, does it work all the time? Where should it be placed in the overall program? Or should it be placed in there at all? And those are questions that often haven't been answered yet.
It's interesting, Manny, when I worked at the University of Arizona as a head strength and conditioning coach, often I'd get a basketball coach or a volleyball coach. I saw this thing at this clinic and so was doing such and such and that looked really good. Can we implement that in our program? Well, time out. Let's talk about this. Let's see, And that happens all the time with strength and conditioning people. And has been able to be agile and knowledgeable enough to discuss it with the head coach, because they're going to want to discuss it, and they're going to want this widget that they found stuck in the program. You've got to be knowledgeable enough to sit down and do it in a fashion that they will understand that you are caring about their athletes, caring about their progress, and that is this really going to make a huge difference, and explain why implementing something new like that can knock the program off. And that you're willing to consider it later on. Let's look at it, but at the moment, this is where we're heading, this is the program we're on, this is the success we've been having based on the monitoring program. Let's just, not ruin a bad thing, a good thing, rather. Sorry.
100%. I think as well, that you mentioned two really good points there. And it's one, we have to speak to the athletes and see where they're at and what their goals are. And again, you both know that I'm a product of Coach Ron McKeefrey. And he, at the start of every year, he will sit down with his athletes and he'll ask, like, what is your goals? Like, what do you want to do? What do you want to achieve? And so what I found really interesting about us is he builds like this bank of what they've said. And from there, whenever they're struggling within the program, within competitions, within their sessions, he'll bring that up and he'll be like, hey, I thought you wanted to go to the NFL. Like, if you want to go there, like, this is what you have to do. Like, it's a constant reminder of, like, this is your goals. This is what you've told me. If you want to get there, like, this is the work that we need to do. And there's really not another option to back away from it. If you want to get there, this is the work that we need to do. And the other thing it's almost that analysis by paralysis by analysis, where nowadays we have so much information that we can get from programs, from VBTs, from you name it, GPSs, force plates, power, whatever. And coaches are having to make all these decisions when if we could just stick to one, is their strength going up? Is their jump metrics going up? Cool, then we can make informed decisions on that and make the program specific to whatever area they are at as a program.
I used to sit down with our athletes and say, okay, going into this season, what do you want to do? What's your goals? Okay, you maybe threw 50 feet in the shot last year. What do you want to do? Well, I want to be the conference champion, okay? What do you need to do that? What's the distance you need to throw? And talk through their goals. Well, you might find that athlete has decided that on Friday night they wanted to go out and have a little party with their friends. You've got a training session on Saturday morning. Well, we need to readjust your goal. If that's your focus for the Friday night, your goal needs to be adjusted. We need to let's see if we can make the final of the conference championship. We'll have to take your goal down a bit. And then if that athlete is really doing well, let's look at going to nationals. So whatever that athlete is saying to you, you've got to feed it back to them and say, well, is your behaviour matching your goal? And that's one way of working. The other way is just making sure that the athlete has input or feels they have input into the program and they have ownership of that program, and that's one way of doing it. I think when you get buy-in from the athlete and they see that things are progressing and being successful, then you're on something good.
Mike, if we can back up a little bit, you kind of touched on something, and I want to go back because it was a really important thing with periodization over a long period of time. You kind of mentioned the 4 years leading up to the Olympics. Obviously, a lot has to go on. They still need to compete year in and year out. They still need to make their points to get to the Olympics. How has that sort of evolved in the programming, and what have you found to work when you are thinking of this like longitudinal periodization block where you're still having to peak them and back off them for individual competitions, but then also make sure that they're at the best peak performance they can be within those Olympic ranges?
Say if you have someone that you're reasonably sure you can get to the Olympics, then a long-term training guideline is really necessary, in my opinion. So you sit down, and as Meg said, you talk to the athlete and so on, but usually you have observed the athlete and their potential. I mean, one thing I think you have to be honest with the athlete and tell them, you don't have the potential to get there. You're not, most likely not going to get there, but I'll help you anyway. But there are athletes where clearly they have the potential. They really need a plan, okay? So you sit down, and I think, as most people know, you kind of work backwards. What meet are you shooting for? What's the calendar, in other words? And USA, American sports, collegiate sports, there's a calendar, and they've still got to compete with that NCAA team. And so you have to work that into the overall calendar as well. Now, if they're not in college, you can then schedule the meets that they, track and field, it might be the Diamond League, or in weightlifting, it might be, the nationals and some international meets and so on. But you schedule those in, and you work around that, and you plan your training program so that they can peak for the important competitions. That doesn't mean they might not lift or compete in some manner in a lesser competition, but you don't necessarily always peak for those. And so you have to plan not only the exercise selection and all that sort of thing, but when are we going to back off? How are we going to back off? And there are some nuances that would take 3 hours just to explain the nuances, but as you move through, in general, with strength power athletes, you go from less specific to more specific within what's called a stage of training. And that would be roughly equal to a macro cycle, as some people term it. But nevertheless, exactly how are you going to do this? And then if things go right, the plan works exactly. Often things don't go exactly right. There's some minor injury, or they get sick, and you have to deal with that. In the NCAA, National Collegiate Athletic Association, college athletes, you've got to take classes. How do you work their schedule around the classes? In Scotland, is how do we work not only sometimes around classes, but around their work schedule? Same thing here. How do you do that? Because, ideally, you're going to be training multiple times per day, possibly. You can't always do that, depending upon work schedules and so on along the line. So how do you manipulate those factors, so to speak, so that you can still produce the best effect? It's not easy to do, and that's why we still have the art of coaching. You've got a scientific basis for it. Just like with medicine. A physician practices the art of medicine, but they have a scientific basis for that. That's what we're trying to establish for strength coaches. They are practicing the art of coaching, but they need a sound scientific basis underlying that. So we do studies, we do short term, we try to do long term. That's very difficult to do, but nevertheless, we do these. Then we apply them directly with athletes or other athletes. Often we try to do them with athletes. That's also difficult to do. But nevertheless, the application, and what we find is that application works. Works well, in fact. And part of it, as I said, is periodization and programming always hard and fast? No. You may have to change it because the athlete is not developing quite as you expected, or they're developing faster than you expected. And you do that through careful monitoring, not just simple observation. So, and let me just go back to one thing here. We talked about strength as a foundation. And what we find often is the athletes come in, they're not very strong. They're simply not very strong. There's a lot of evidence, research and observational, that if you get stronger, that alone is as good or better than power training or velocity training. I mean, strength is a foundation, and there are plenty of studies and observational studies showing that if you will get stronger first, one, your power and velocity will get better. And the second really important thing is when you do switch to more of a power, for example, focus in your training, you will adapt better to it. And so the end product is going to be better. And one thing I always tell students and coaches, if you don't believe anything else I say, if you want to get strong, you got to lift heavy weights. There's no way around that.
Mm-hmm. I think as well as a industry, we often forget the pathologies behind how strength, power, endurance actually gets developed. Like, to be able to fire all neurons, you have to activate them all. That comes from a solid foundation of strength. The more strength you have, the more you can fire. Then you develop power. So the power is how quick can you lift this force over a period of time. And then we go into that hypertrophy where now we're creating size within the muscle to be able to add more strength, add more speed, quickness into it, to be able to use the whole muscle as opposed to just parts of the muscle. Like, that's one thing that I always go back to, and it's like, how am I effectively using everything that I can develop within the athlete? Again, strength is my foundation. I'll then go to power, build size, go back, and start utilizing all the pathways that we've sort of built up on.
It's basically, as we have said, it's a long-term process. And
it's interesting, Manny. Observation. You see a lot of international, very, very good international endurance runners or athletes in general that haven't built that base of strength, particularly endurance athletes. They do all these tiddly-widdly exercises that are supposed to give you a bit of flexibility, and they're done and they're administered in the name of strength. And they're not really strength exercises. If you do something for 10 to 20 to 30 reps, it doesn't necessarily build strength. But endurance people seem to believe that. So what happens? You've got injuries, ankle, knee, hip. And, some of our top international endurance runners that are not from Africa or wherever, they're injured continually injured, because they haven't built that base of strength. One other thing I think that Doc touched on, but I think is really important, is thinking through. When you've got an athlete who can go to the Olympic Games, and they're capable of going to the Olympic Games 2, 3 or 4 times, they've shown it as a youngster, you can see them when they're coming through. Plan that out. What are you going to do your first year? Okay, you've been to an Olympic Games. What are you going to do the next year? Are you going to continue to pound your body? What are you going to do the second year past the Games? What are you going to do the third year going into the next Games? The planning of those years are so key and so fundamental to getting medals. And we don't do it. A lot of people just do not do it. They just keep running in the Diamond League, get more money. And eventually you'll go to 2 or 3 Olympics and your body's wrecked. Mm-hmm. You've got knee injury and back injury. All your life you're carrying these injuries. And it's because of a lack of planning, lack of thought.
I think that brings up another important point. We see all the time coaches pushing athletes too fast. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And not only does that invite injury, but there is evidence to suggest that if you push, on high-intensity programs and so on, if you push them too fast, they, in a sense, reach peak level fast, but they don't improve any. And then if you take your time, it might take longer to get up to the top, but you can get further up than you could have otherwise, and you can stay there longer.
100%. I also liked what Doc said, and it's periodization at that level. It's no longer periodization, but it's a guideline. I think that's also very important to talk about, and it's this fact that, again, as Doc said, like, things happen, injuries, illnesses. Like, a periodization is a good guideline to what you can do, but if something comes up, you can also adapt and make sure that there's steps in there to prepare them for what is going to happen next.
And if you plan your program correctly, a lot of that, I guess you'd say, is already built in. I mean, and people don't realize this. I mean, for example, there should be in the programming heavy and light days that are built in, partially for fatigue management. There are some other reasons as well. Unload weeks, active rest at certain times, and so on. And all of those things are built in ahead of time to allow the athlete to better adapt to the whole training process and not run them in the ground. The last thing you want to do is run them in the ground. And people talk about auto-regulation. If you look at a good programming model, much of that auto-regulation is already built in by having ranges for the intensity that you're supposed to be using. In other words, the load or the speed at which you run and so on. Those are already built in if you do things correctly. But even on top of that, I don't care. I've never seen or known of an athlete, including me, that didn't have an injury sometime. I mean, it may be a nagging injury. Times that's going to happen. And you've got to be able, and this is one thing, as a coach, you've got to be knowledgeable enough, smart enough to be able to train around that. And or decide, okay, it's not that bad, we can train through it. And I think that's an extremely important idea, is that you have to know, if you're going to coach, you've got to know the athlete. You have to.
100%. I
Because
always
I'll
go
tell
back
you,
to this. Sorry.
One thing
Yeah.
that we have noticed from day one, elite athletes in particular are terrible coaches for themselves. They'll do things to themselves that they wouldn't do to anybody else. That's one reason you need at least a consultant and say, okay, whoa, you're doing the wrong thing here. You're going to end up hurt or overly tired and so on. It's very important that you have somebody to lean on, so to speak, dealing with your training. I mean, I don't know how many times I can tell you, we've had to hold athletes at that level back because they were just going too hard. It's like you just disappeared.
And I think that's, again, it's the peaks and valleys behind performance. And it's understanding that you don't always have to go 100%. You can back away and it'd still be as effective. I don't know if you've read the book Peak Performance, but essentially I had this really good section on it where it actually recommends athletes take a week off before their major games or their major competition to allow all the adaptations to set in, so that when they do start competing, they're refreshed, they're not sore, they're ready for that peaking of their performance. And again, it doesn't happen with everyone, but it's this idea where you also have to recover as hard as you do train.
No doubt about recovery being extremely important. I don't know about taking the whole week off, but certainly the volume of training is going to be reduced. Mm-hmm. The frequency of training usually about the same, but the total volume of work should come down. Mm-hmm. There are some pretty good studies beginning to come out suggesting how much it should come down and then how it should come down. But that's still in the works. Another important aspect is this idea of general to less specific to more specific. And the exercises and et cetera, should become much more task specific at that point. But again, that's a 3-hour discussion.
I'll get you in for that 3-hour discussion.
It depends on the athlete too, who you work.
Have you seen the new book from It's Kramer, Ratmas, and Thomas Newman. It's called Developing the Athlete. I'll see if I've got it here. I'll show you. So I think it's in my backpack because I'll put it up here. Okay, so my screen sharing isn't working. But it's so it's Developing the Athlete, an applied sports science roadmap for optimizing performance. It's Dr. William Kramer, Nicholas Ratmes, and Thomas Newman. So I read that last year. Sorry?
I've seen that too. I thought you meant a video, but I have seen the book now that you mention it.
So I really liked it because... Sorry? I think there's a lag.
It's Bill Kramer's book, yeah. I think we have that.
We've got it somewhere.
But a really good section that's on it is essentially the different ways where you can technically avoid the deload weeks on it. So as opposed to having deload weeks, it's talking about how to fit the training onto what the athlete is feeling on a day by day. And I think they test their jump performance, whatever percentage they're at on their peak jumps as the baseline. Then they program based on that. And it's something that Thomas Newman did at Yale when he was there. And like I've seen the graphs from that time, and it was like everyone was on the same periodized program, but everyone had different sessions depending on how they came in. Now it is a lot of work to make sure that that's happening, but it seems to be quite effective in relation to making sure that athlete is getting exactly what they need every single session.
There are some ways of trying that, but here is a problem that you run into. Everybody's experienced this, and this is one of the reasons you can't really go by subjective evaluations. How many times have you known yourself or an athlete go out on the track or in the weight room, oh, I'm feeling awful, I need to back off. But then they start warming up, and lo and behold, they have a good workout. So you have to be real careful about that. That's why you need to have a coach there, and as you warm up, that's when you make the decision, not based on a subjective evaluation or a vertical jump or something like that before you start warming up. And that's why you build in ranges to the programming, to the sets and reps, to the intensity in the sets and reps. That's exactly why you build that in, is that it allows the athlete to say, okay, I'm not feeling at my greatest, my warm-ups didn't go well, the coach and I think I ought to be down here instead of up here. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, 100%. And I think that's kind of what you were touching on before. There's so much stuff out there now that you kind of have to discern what is effective and what isn't effective. And I think so this is where I really like the way you have been speaking, because it does seem like you really collaborate on that science meets practicality of strength training.
At this point, coaching is like being a medical doctor. It's still an art, but you've got a scientific basis for what you do.
It's interesting, Manny, many strength coaches have said to me, what do you need this physiology stuff for? What do you need this biomechanics thing? Why do we need to bother with it? Well, my response is basic. Every time you go into a gym, or every time you walk into a weight room, or you walk onto a court, or you go into a track, and you ask an athlete to do anything, your focus is making a change in the body of that athlete, whether it be muscle type, whether it be heart function, whether it be whatever. You're having a basic effect on their physiology. So you better know what you're doing. You better know how to plan if you want optimal.
I think as well, when we're talking about strength and conditioning, about physiology, biomechanics, psychology, I think a lot of people think them as different aspects of sports and not as like, how can we assess all of them and make sure that our programs are or we understand a bit of everything so that we can make our programs effective. I know that you are a little bit pushed for time today, so I want to thank you so much for coming on to the podcast and giving up some of your time to talk. If you could let people know sort of where they can find you and maybe reach out.
Probably my best, probably just my email address at Edinburgh University is probably best. It's capital M dot E dot Stone at AC UK. That's Edinburgh University email.
Perfect.
And
No, thank you so much for coming on.
And, well, shortly I will have an Edinburgh University email because I'm an honorary professor there. But you can get me through Meg's email would be the simplest way to remember that, yeah.
I can send that to you, Manny.
Yeah, that would be perfect. Yeah, I appreciate you so much for coming on today.
Okay, thank you for asking. Thank you.